Hey everybody, Christopher Wing here, and as you can see, I've got on my retro vintage logo style Epcot Center t-shirt, which by the way was designed by my good friend Rich Terpstra, so hi Rich. And that means it is time for me to talk about Epcot. So when we last left off in my journey around the world to visit every Disney theme park on Earth in under 80 hours, I had boarded a plane in LAX bound for Orlando. So I landed there at about 7 a.m., a little after, and got into my rental car. Incidentally, I live in Washington State, so it was a little funny that when I got my rental car, it had Washington State plates on it, so I felt like I was back home. But in any event, I drove to Epcot to begin my tour of the four parks that are in Florida. Epcot Center, Disney's MGM, Disney's MGM, Disney's Hollywood Studios, excuse me, Disney's Animal Kingdom, and finally, of course, the Magic Kingdom, which is the park with the castle and Mickey Mouse and everything that most people think of when they think of Walt Disney World. So I decided to start at Epcot for a couple of strategic reasons. The first of which is that far and away Epcot has the easiest parking lot to get in and out of. This was the only place on my trip where I was actually going to be driving myself around and had to park a car. So I chose Epcot partly because definitely it's the easiest place to park in all of Walt Disney World relative to getting in and out of the theme park quickly. The second reason is because that day Epcot had extra morning magic hours, so that meant that I could get into the park early. Now, in Florida, extra magic hours are only available to people who are staying in a hotel that's run by Disney on property, and a few others. There are some exceptions, but generally that's it. Now, I wasn't staying in any hotels at all on my trip, so I toyed with the idea of booking a room and then checking in and immediately checking out afterwards just so I could use early entry. Luckily, I didn't have to do that because this was the second place where I was going to have a film crew following me around. So they agreed to let me into the park early, along with anybody else who had extra morning magic hours privileges that day. Now you might think that that gave me some kind of extra special privilege or leg up or something, but not really, because pretty much all of that extra morning magic hour time was spent with Baymax. Now, this was not part of my original plan, and I was already on a very, very tight schedule, and this is going to be a recurring theme, actually, because as much as I was thrilled to have Disney actually following me around with the camera crew and covering my time in the parks, it did lead to some interesting logistical challenges. And one of the first of those was basically the very first thing we did was not get on Spaceship Earth, which was my original plan, but instead spend that extra morning magic hour time going to see Baymax, which was cool. I mean, I did get sort of backdoor front of the line access to do that. I got my own private meet and greet with Baymax, who was the robot from Big Hero 6. And it was cool and fun, but not really part of my original plan. And it actually ended up taking a fair amount of time. So that by the time we were done with that, kind of regular park hours were just about to start, and I had just a few minutes basically to get on Spaceship Earth and ride it so that I can actually say that I rode an attraction in the park. So I basically just got on that ride and rode it myself while the camera crew waited for me near the exit. And so I might as well talk a little bit about Epcot and Spaceship Earth. As I mentioned in one of my previous videos, Epcot was not originally supposed to be a theme park at all. It was really supposed to be a living, working, functioning city of the future, and it had all these crazy futuristic concepts, and like all the transportation would be below ground, and then that way everybody could walk around at ground level and not have to cross roads or anything, and there would be elevated people movers for people who need to get between buildings in a hurry, and maybe even a glass dome over the whole thing, and all these crazy ideas. But after Walt died, unfortunately, the whole concept of having an actual functioning city smack in the middle of Walt Disney World sort of went by the wayside. But they still kind of kept alive the idea of having this place where people could meet and interact, and business leaders and different people from different countries get together and share ideas and so forth. And the more people thought about it, the more it sounded basically like a World's Fair. So really what they ended up kind of pitching the idea of Epcot to be would be a permanent World's Fair. And actually Epcot is kind of a permanent World's Fair, especially now that I've actually been to an actual World's Fair. Last year I went to the World's Fair in Milan, And it was the first time I've ever been to a real World's Fair, and it was actually quite a bit like Epcot. There were lots of different pavilions for different countries, and a few other pavilions that were focused around things like farming and industry. So it was actually very similar. In fact, when they were designing Epcot originally, they couldn't really decide whether or not they wanted to have something that was going to focus more on the future and technology and science and kind of the cutting edge of stuff versus having all the different pavilions with the different countries and kind of looking at the past and the culture side of things. And one day they literally just said, hey, let's take these two models of these two different projects that we've built and just shove them together. And that's how you get the kind of gargantuanly double-sized Epcot Center that you have today. By doing that, they also kind of doubled the cost of the entire project, and it ended up not only doubling, but sort of tripling and quadrupling, and having horrible cost overruns, which we may come back to a little bit later when we get to talking about Tokyo. But until then, luckily they did spend the money, they did build what, in my opinion, is probably one of the most original theme parks on planet Earth. Now, because it is kind of a different type of park, a very radical departure for Disney from the typical, Magic Kingdom style park with a castle and Mickey Mouse and Haunted Mansion and the storybook fairy tale rides and things like that. I think they realized from the outset that they needed a way to distinguish it not only in terms of what's in the park, but just visually how the park even looks, even as you're approaching it. And one way they did that was to build this giant mammoth sphere as the icon for the entire project, which we know today as Spaceship Earth. Now, the idea of having a kind of iconic dome as the focal point of your sort of World's Fair type park has a historical precedent. In 1967, in Montreal, at the World's Fair that was held there that year, the United States Pavilion was a giant geodesic dome. And you can see in this picture, it even had a monorail that went around it, just like ours does. And it was designed by a guy named Buckminster Fuller, who was a really brilliant architect and mathematician and scientist and had a lot of really clever, interesting ideas. In fact, he wrote a book about some of them that was called An Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth. And that is where we got the name for the dome that he also ended up also inspiring. Incidentally, the dome in Montreal hung around for a while. Unfortunately, in 1976, it caught on fire, and the translucent panels that covered the whole thing basically melted. But luckily, all was not lost. The superstructure still exists today, and if you're ever in Montreal, you can go take a look at it. Now it's kind of like an ecological park inside of there, but it's still really interesting to see if you have the chance. But getting back to Spaceship Earth, one interesting difference between the Montreal sphere and ours is the one in Montreal was sort of 3/4 of a sphere that basically sat on the ground, whereas ours is almost a complete sphere that you can actually walk underneath. And the question arose, well, how do you actually support that structurally? How do you have it sort of float in midair? So they hit around the idea of having these sort of legs on certain sides of the sphere. And this is actually a picture of a drawing from Marty Sklar's book, Dream It, Do It. It's one of the original concept sketches of how to achieve this, where basically you have these legs on either side that hold up basically this sort of central ring around the middle, and then the bottom half of the sphere can hang suspended off of that ring, and then the top half of the sphere can basically sit on top of it like it's sitting on a table, and that way the entire thing can be suspended seemingly in midair. And it worked out really well. Now, if you haven't been inside Spaceship Earth, what's in there is basically a ride that tells you the history of communication from the dawn of man's existence and cave paintings to ancient Egypt and papyrus scrolls to the Renaissance and the Industrial Age and all the way up into modern telecommunications of today and beyond. Now, over the years, Spaceship Earth, the attraction, has gone through a lot of revisions as technology has changed and just times and tastes have changed as well. So when it very first opened, it had pretty much no music at all, and it had a narration by this guy, who I'm guessing probably none of you actually know who this is, because he's an actor named Lawrence Dobkin. He's actually been in a lot of movies, including The Sweet Smell of Success and even North by Northwest. So he did the original narration from 1982 to 1986. And I've got this book here called The Epcot Explorer's Encyclopedia by R.A. Peterson. And in it, it actually has some little snippets from the original narration. Now, I cannot act to save my life. I think you can see that in the video that Disney posted of me at the parks, but I'm going to give it my best here. So here's how his original opening lines went. Where have we come from? Where are we going? The answers begin in our past. In the dust from which we were formed, answers recorded on the walls of time. So let us journey into that past, to seek those walls, to know ourselves, and to probe the destiny of our spaceship Earth. There you go. In 1986, I guess they decided that the original narration was a little stale and stodgy and there was no music, so they decided to kind of plus up the ride, change a few scenes around, and get Walter Cronkite to do the narration with a totally new script. So I got a little bit of his. Now again, I apologize for the horrible acting. For eons, our planet has drifted as a spaceship through the universe, and for a brief moment we have been its passengers. Yet in that time, we've made tremendous progress in our ability to record and share knowledge. So let's journey back 40,000 years to the dawn of recorded history. So there you go. That's my horrible Walter Cronkite impression. But in addition to a new narration, it also had new music, including probably one of the most familiar songs from the 1980s era Epcot Center. Then in 1994, I guess they decided that things were getting a little bit trapped in the 80s there, so they decided to redo the ride again, and they brought in Jeremy Irons to record yet another new narration, and his went like this. Like a grand and miraculous spaceship, our planet has sailed through the universe of time, and for a brief moment we have been among its many passengers. From the very beginning, we have always sought to reach out to one another, to bridge the gaps between us, to communicate. So there you go, that's Jeremy Irons. So, yeah, and then they took out the Tomorrow's Child ending and put in a thing with a bunch of kids trying to operate a computer to build a bee to fly virtual reality through a computer-generated landscape and so forth, and it was kind of strange. And then just recently in 2008, they decided to redo it again with Judi Dench. Now, this book doesn't have her opening lines, but it does have probably, unfortunately, her most infamous lines. The Judi Dench narration, I mean, nothing against Judi Dench. I think she's a great actress, but the script wasn't quite, in my opinion, up to the standard of the other ones. It's a little dumbed down, and so it has lines like this. Remember how easy it was to learn your ABCs? Thank the Phoenicians. They invented them. Yeah, not quite as grand and miraculous of a spaceship anymore as it used to be. But in any event, it's still kind of fun. In the present day version, in addition to the Dame Judi Dench narration, there are also some new show scenes, including this one that I snuck a little video of myself. And then at the end of the ride, they added this sort of little video game kind of thing where you answer a bunch of questions and it kind of shows you what your life will be like in the future, in a kind of little retro style cartoon where they take your face and Photoshop it into the body of the little cartoon stick figure running around on the screen. And it's cheesy, but I don't know, I think it's kind of fun. So I always enjoy that part of the ride because previously it was pretty much just a long downward spiral with not very much to look at. After I got done riding Spaceship Earth, I met back up with the film crew and they smuggled me out of the back of Epcot through a special cast member only gate outside the back of Universe of Energy, where there was a van waiting to take me to Disney's Hollywood Studios. So that is where we will pick up in the next chapter of the story. Until then, see you soon.